Hey, good evening. This is Bob Burnett with episode 3 of Old Man Yells. I had a different episode that I had planned on recording tonight, but I pivoted about an hour ago when I realized there was something happening within the Bitcoin community, specifically within the mining world and the mempool that really needed some commentary. So we're going to save that one for another day later in the week, but here goes. I think when you get into Bitcoin, one of the first things you learn is that as soon as you think you have things figured out, as soon as you think you might know maybe which way things are going, you get surprised. And so I'm fairly experienced in this now, but I must admit, even I am surprised by what is happening right now. We're going to dive into that. What really is happening is we're seeing transaction count on the mempool at all-time highs. And it's doing some very interesting things, and it's teaching us some very interesting things. So before we get into that, what that is and what it means, I want to just do a little primer and a little education session. Some of this will be a refresher for those of you who are more experienced, but hopefully there's a few nuggets even in this part for those of you who are a little more schooled and experienced. So as a miner, and I run commercial mining operations with my company, Barefoot Mining, what we have to do is we don't have customers. We make all of our revenue based on what's happening on the network. You know, how many blocks are we participating in Help Mine? And so when we look, though, at the overall mining community, basically we have a pretty simple formula to determine how well the mining industry as a whole is going to do on any given day. Basically, we have the block reward and the number of blocks a day. And the block reward is a combination of the subsidy, block subsidy, which is new Bitcoin coming into the system, and fees, which are, I sometimes like to think of them as tips. They're a fee paid by the sender to call attention to that transaction and try to get the miners and the mining pools to include that particular transaction in the block. Now, the second part of that is the blocks per day. I think most people, and I think about blocks per day, and they think about 10-minute blocks. And if you divide that up, so that means 6 per hour times 24 hours is 144 per day. But the reality is that's not really what happens. What really happens is block times vary. A little interesting historical nugget for everybody is that in the whole history of the Bitcoin mining network, the average block processing time is 9 minutes, 36 seconds. In the last year, it is 9 minutes, 48 seconds. So what's happened is over time, we're coming closer and closer to that 10-minute level. And I think probably someday we'll be varying only a handful of seconds off of that 10-minute period. But block times are fall in this range. And for miners, that's material, because a 9-minute, for instance, 48-second blocks means that we get about 147 blocks per day instead of 144, and that's a whole bunch of extra revenue. Now, the block subsidy, which we talked about before, I think a lot of you've heard about this before. The block subsidy is 6 1/4. The halving, the big deal about the halving is that every 210,000 blocks, that number gets cut in half. It started at 50, then 25, 12.5. We're at 6 1/4 now. We're going to 3.125. Roughly a year from today, we'll hit 840,000th block, and we'll have that shift. So miners are paying attention to this, of course, because the profitability and the top line revenue for miners is definitely impacted by that. If you measure your business in Bitcoin, well, you've got a 50% decrease in the subsidy right off the bat. So what happens with fees is a really big deal. And historically, fees have been all over. We've had periods of time where fees got up in the 10 or 15% of miner revenue. We saw that, for instance, in the period from 2020 and early 2021. But then interestingly, right after the China mining ban, that number fell, and it fell hard. And it fell down to really a range of 1 to 3%, or translated into Bitcoin, meaning about 0.15 Bitcoin to 0.3 Bitcoin per block was the reward. So, by the way, when we look back at the period last year, the second half of last year, which was just an utter disaster for all of us in the mining business, we were not only hit with very low price, but we were hit with low fees as well. So it was a pretty brutal period, frankly. And I'm sure, as you are all aware, I'll do more commentary in the future. You know, we lost some members of the mining community. We had some bankruptcies. We've had some consolidations. I can say, as a miner, it was a very hard time for us. It certainly was not lucrative. I'll put it that way. It was a very difficult time. We were in survival mode. We're doing a little better this year, really since the first of the year, but especially probably since the latter part of January as the price recovered, the market is doing better. But we're still digging out of a big hole. It was still a very difficult time. Well, about April 26th, things started to change dramatically on the fee front. Instead of that 0.15, 0.25, maybe a good day where you'd see a 0.4 on a given block, we suddenly saw it lift to 1. We started to see the mempool fill up, and we'd see the mempool with a backlog of 100,000 transactions, 150,000 transactions. And by the way, each block only produces maybe between 2,000 and 5,000 transactions, and depending on the size of those transactions and what the miners select for that transaction really determines it. So obviously that's a big backlog. Let's say you're averaging even 5,000 at the upper end. If the backlog is 100,000, well, you're 20 blocks behind, and while you're processing those 20 blocks, more transactions are going to come in. And so we're seeing several hour transaction queues for some of the folks. Well, on April 26th, we started to see a leap, and we started to see like 1 Bitcoin per block in fees. I must say, even within my own organization, that was pretty exciting. We were thrilled with that. That would put us up in that, lower teens area as a percent of the revenue, lifting the total revenue per block over 7, and that was very exciting. And then a few days later, we started seeing it drifting up more toward 1.5. Over this weekend, we started to see 2. Earlier today, we started to see 5. So I've had a busy weekend at a personal level, but I have to admit that I started watching the mempool and the fees associated with block times, much like maybe many of us watch the price of Bitcoin during some of the bull runs, checking it constantly. It's a very exciting thing. Well, to give you an idea of how good things have become, at least for right now over the weekend, on a normal day, the entire Bitcoin network for the first half of the year was generating about 947 Bitcoin per day. And if we, for instance, use a price of about 28,500, which is where we are today. Then we have about $27 million per day spread out across all the mining industry for all of us to share. And as I hope some of you know, from a statistical basis, if you owned 10% of the hash rate and mining revenue was 27,000, you would over any extended period of time get $2.7 million per day on average. It's a pretty simple equation. But anyway, 947 Bitcoin per day or 27 million. Where we sit right now is because the Bitcoin network is generating so much. I just ran some stats on the last 14 blocks before I came here and sat down. We're averaging 11.58 Bitcoin per block. We're running a little slow though. We're running at only about 139 blocks per day, but still that's 1,610 Bitcoin per day, or about $47 million in revenue, which is 70% increase from where we were just a few days ago. Obviously, for those of us that have been struggling really in survival mode for quite a while, this is hugely refreshing and comforting. And whether it lasts or not, we'll talk about that in a second, my views on that. But at a minimum, you know, it's a cool glass of water for a very thirsty industry. Before I talk about some of these implications, I want to talk about one other thing. A very historical marker was hit earlier tonight. It happened on block 788,695. And in that block, the fees were higher than the subsidy. For the very first time in Bitcoin's history, the fees were higher than the subsidy. That happened about 3 hours ago. This is roughly 10 o'clock Eastern time, US. And since that time, that's happened two more times. So we've now had 3 occurrences where the fees exceeded the subsidy. It's a big, big deal. Now, we're sitting today, by the way, with a backlog just under 500,000 transactions. If you peel back the onion to look into those transactions, and a lot of those that have been filling the mempool and being processed in these blocks, a lot of them are very small. There's actually a pattern to some of them. Shout out to Francis on Twitter, who actually brought this to my attention. And then I looked into it and confirmed what he had said. But there's a whole bunch of transactions that are only 565 Satoshis, very tiny. And almost all of them are now paying well over the value of the transaction in fees. I learned a new term today that I'll share with you, which is called a dust transaction. And so a dust transaction is a transaction in which the fees paid to process the transaction exceed the value of the transaction itself. Now, clearly, I don't think this is sustainable. There is something going on in the network right now that's causing this. Most likely it has something to do with kind of the ordinal craze, and we'll make a little comment on that in a second. Personally, some people are very concerned about it. I respect anybody that feels that way. I am not. Some people feel this may be a denial of service attack or a test run for a denial of service attack. I don't think that that's the case. And I think that what it is proving, if nothing else, is that somebody trying to create a denial of service attack is going to pay a ransom to do it, and that they can only do so as long as their money holds out. But I'll also point out that in my opinion, I think that it's improper for us to make a judgment about any transaction that's in the pool. And by the way, not all transactions may not be financially motivated. So even in this case of these thus transactions where the value being transferred may be exceeded by the cost of it, it may be that the person initiating that transaction is trying to accomplish something other than a transfer of value. It could just be that because the Bitcoin blockchain is the greatest and potentially only point of truth known to mankind, somebody wants to record something for all prosperity at that certain point in time. But again, it really doesn't matter whether I'm right or wrong in that speculation. In my opinion, we just have to let these things happen. The Bitcoin network is processing this properly. We have people willing to pay to use the network, and that's what's happening. Now, let's talk about what the implications of what's going on are. So first, in the short term, as I said, this is very healthy for a mining industry that's been in a lot of pain. So whatever is causing it at least in the short term, this is very refreshing for those in the business. The second thing is that we're at a point where it will not take much for the rack space that's out there and for the mining servers, which are currently at a great value and in wild supply, for both of those things to reverse course very, very quickly. The purpose of this podcast is not an advertisement. I can say for us at Barefoot Mining, we have a limited amount of rack space available. We do have access to mining equipment on with very good prices and very short availability. If you're interested in getting into mining, whether that's something you're going to run yourself or you're going to work with a hosting provider like ourselves, or if you want to invest in a private enterprise, we're actually funding a couple private enterprises right now too. Now is the time. You're probably not going to get a better value because either this fee thing will keep going or any change in the Bitcoin price is going to change all these economics. Warren Buffett, who I'm not a fan of, but I'm going to steal one of his quotes. He says, be fearful when others are greedy and greedy when others are fearful. Well, the world is still, for the most part, fearful about mining. And so following that logic, then now would be a time to be greedy. Another thing we learned is, I think, a valuable lesson about scarcity. For us in the Bitcoin community, scarcity is a big deal. I think we can look at block space as something that is very finite, much like we have a 21 million cap on the monetary supply for Bitcoin. Well, the block space itself is limited. It's about 4 megabytes of block space every 10 minutes. And we can see what a precious commodity that is right now, and that it doesn't take much for that to start skyrocketing. You see an exponential change in the price of space on in the mempool and to get onto a block as a result of this. Another lesson for, I think, all of us out there is that if you have a lot of smaller UTXOs, don't get lazy. Now's the time to consolidate those, or maybe wait for a little bit of a break. And the next time you see a break and fees come back down, go and get those consolidated into a smaller number of UTXOs, because you do not want in the future to be sending a transaction that's just a ton of UTXOs. That could get unbearably expensive. You might find yourself in one of these dust transaction situations. Another lesson, the Lightning Network and all the things that are happening, Fedimint and all these things that are happening at higher layers, the development of those needs to occur. We need to have ways of transacting without base layer resolution. And And here's a great lesson, because there are certainly cases where what we're seeing today is just the norm, or maybe even worse if you want to look at a full mempool as worse. Maybe we'll have a million transaction backlog at some point. Also, we'll talk about this another time, but Stratum V2, which is an initiative to allow miners themselves, not the mining pools, to build the blocks and pick transactions in the blocks, that could be very, very important in the future. And I think having relationships with miners that maybe can help transactions get through, especially for organizations that maybe are moving to a Bitcoin standard, and they need to make sure that they can get their transactions through. I think you're going to see kind of a new world and a new set of relationships established as a result of that. And finally, there's a lot of FUD, I think, especially from the crypto folks, about what will happen as the subsidy goes down, and will the miners have enough incentive to secure the network? I think we've just proven that that's not something to worry about. As I said, the maybe the most significant thing today is we just saw today 3 blocks where the fees were greater than the subsidy. Now, in a year, if we kind of settle back down, I don't think we're going to stay where we are, by the way, but I'm not sure we're going to go back to that 1 to 3% level either. I think something in the 10 to 20% range is very reasonable, though, and probably with periods of time where it spikes. And I'm talking about the near term, maybe over the next year or so. And so I think probably what will happen is we'll see this a lot more frequently in the next halving cycle. And by the following one, I think we'll very comfortably be at a space where fees exceed the subsidy on almost every block. So I hope this helps maybe give you a few tidbits and a little insight into what's happening. Paying attention to what's going on is, I think, critical for anybody here. I want to recommend a couple sites. If you don't spend time on mempool.space, I recommend that you do that. Play around with it, click on the blocks, see what's going on. It's really important. There are some other great blockchain explorers. Timechain.com is another great one. I've just recently found that one. It's a great little dashboard. Give that one a try as well. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up for tonight. Thanks for listening. We'll see you soon.